Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to JWA's Film Club. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. So happy to be back with you tonight for the fourth and sadly final session of this series. But don't worry, we have more great programs coming up soon. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone so we can see who's with us tonight. And please also, throughout the conversation, remember to put your questions and comments into the chat. We love to have a robust conversation happening there. We're really, really glad to have everybody with us and to be able to continue our meaningful conversations and learning together. A few words about JWA. If you don't know us yet, we are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world, and we offer many different opportunities to bring the lenses of history and of gender to the pressing issues of our time. These virtual programs are just one small aspect of JWA's work, and so I encourage you to check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A quick logistical note: if you would like captioning, you can click the button that says Show Captions CC button on the bottom where it says where you have the bar of options to choose, and that should hopefully turn them on for you. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening. Burnett Gregory is a writer and filmmaker based in Los Angeles. Her bylines include Refinery 29, Them, Cosmo UK, and Autostraddle, where she's been on staff as a film critic and culture writer for 4 years. She was selected as a notable writer in the 2022 Outfest Screenwriting Lab and is currently in post-production on her film, Chloe and James. Welcome, Drew. So glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here and talking about this movie.
So why don't you kick us off with the thoughts you've prepared, and then we will talk from there.
Great.
Awesome.
So when Kissing Jessica Stein was released in March of 2002, I was 9 years old. The next year, I would start Hebrew school, beginning the process that would culminate in my bar mitzvah. At the time, I didn't know that a bat mitzvah would have been more appropriate for me, and I wouldn't know that for another decade after I became a man. The acronym LGBT has been popular since the 90s, but when Kissing Jessica Stein came out and when I was growing up, the B and T were simultaneously ignored and misrepresented. And you might be like, how can something be ignored and misrepresented? And, you know, it was like, there was more of a pastiche of us without the words. You know, you'd have like cross-dressers or, you know, people who had had sex changes as like the villains in horror movies. You would have like used to be a man or someone who like, I don't know, like was a man as like the punchline in a lot of bro comedies. And then bisexual women were everywhere while also rarely being respected. You know, you had like shows ranging from Friends to the OC would have like a very special episode or an arc where a character would explore sexuality or kiss a girl, and it was because they knew that two women kissing would get ratings, but not necessarily be something that they wanted to respect as an identity. And you also see that with like famous women at the time, like Drew Barrymore, Angelina Jolie, who would come out as bisexual, and then it would just be sort of dismissed as part of their personas of promiscuity or personas of like being a bad girl. And I think that transness and bisexuality share a fluidity. They involve change and movement and sort of a dismissal of mainstream structures. And like when I was growing up, there's plenty of classic homophobia, but I do think that people were more willing to admit that like some people were gay than to question their entire understanding of sexuality and gender. And by the time I was bar mitzvahed, like I'd already recognized that I wasn't like other boys, and many people had accused me of being gay, as if it's something to accuse. But I like knew that this wasn't true because not only did I have crushes on girls, but I had like very intense crushes on girls that also had envy involved in them, right? And it wasn't just the lack of language that prevented me from knowing myself, it was also the lack of room for exploration, which brings us to Jessica Stein. Because, like a Rilke quote may be enough to get this lifelong straight woman to meet up with another woman from a dating service. But, like, is it enough to be a lesbian, like to change her entire view of herself, to like change other people's view of her? She's not just like allowed to kiss Helen, to date Helen, to see where it goes without labels, or at least it's how she feels. Like she feels like she doesn't have that space to explore. And it's not in the movie, like it's not just Jessica, right? Like she may care more what other people think, but even Helen faces pushback. The first time I watched Kissing Jessica Stein, I bristled at a lot of the biphobia and casual racism of one of her cis white gay male friends. But watching it now, it seems like a really apt portrait of that person at that time. Like, despite being gay himself, he's not welcoming to his friend's exploration. He's dismissive. Uh, when the movie came out, as some of you know, a lot of the lesbian community kind of did the same thing. People hated that Jessica and Helen don't end up together. People hated the implication that Jessica wasn't gay and might even end up with her ex and former boss, Josh. Like, even though Helen very explicitly does end up with another woman, right? And I do understand. And again, I was 9 in 2002, and I'm aware that, like, there was better lesbian representation in 2002 than there was trans representation or bisexual representation, but it still wasn't a lot. And there's especially this kind of like fun rom-com. There wasn't a lot. Like it's still 3 years before Imagine Me and You, and there was stuff. A lot of it was indie, and Kissing Jessica Stein is indie, but it's indie in this sort of like it's a certain aesthetic, a certain quality that is. It's really fun. It's a really funny, fun movie, and so I get the desire to have them end up together, the desire to have a happy ending. And even I first saw the movie uh, in 2017, like right after I'd come out, and I hated the ending because as a new queer person, like I related so much to Jessica and related so much to her anxiety, her like very specific Jewish anxiety, and her very specific relationship with her very specific Jewish mom. And to see her decide to be straight hurt. But if our goal is exploration, and if our goal is people like Jessica not having to be anxious to kiss a girl with a Rilke quote and a good blend of lipsticks, like if our goal is people like me not having to be like depressed and confused until my early 20s, then we need queer movies that go beyond easy identification. And the fact is, we don't really know what the future holds for Jessica. Like maybe she gets back together with Josh. Maybe the cute girl making eyes at her in that last scene like ends up making a move. And maybe the problem for Jessica and Helen isn't that Jessica's straight, but that Jessica and Helen from the beginning have very different sex drives. Like if we're to believe, which based on interviews and stuff, it seems like the creators kind of wanted us to believe is that like Helen basically realizes she's a lesbian. And in the beginning of the movie, though, she's like having so much sex with men, she just has a really high sex drive. And so these people aren't compatible in that way. Um, and the movie is still very much a product of its time and the people who made it, because it was co-written by the leads, Jennifer Westfeldt and Heather Dickinson, and it began as an adaptation of their play that was about dating men, or started as a series of sketches about dating men. And I don't know if Jurgensen identifies as queer, but Westphal has said that Jurgensen is still the only, like there was some 20-year anniversary piece where she said like that Jurgensen's still the only woman she's ever kissed. And I do think you can feel the director Charles Herman Wormfeld's gay, and I feel like you feel his perspective very much through the film, but it's still different. He's not a lesbian, and it's unclear if the movie had any lesbians involved, and maybe a lesbian who could have understood like how hungry queer audiences were for a happier ending, or to like at the very least have a queer woman who could finesse those final moments so it feels like Jessica's sexuality is a little bit more open-ended. But even if Jessica is straight, I just like can't bring myself to see the relationship as anything but positive for these two characters. I think like the movie uses time jumps really well to allow the relationship to have time to settle. And even though like, you know, they're the dramatic beats it has to hit and it jumps forward to hit those beats, we don't get to spend the like 3 months, 6 months where they're just dating. And that stuff's really important. And I think it's really important that they put that in there, even though it's as simple as like a title card that says 3 months later and then another one that says 3 months later. Like it to me says that they're taking the relationship seriously. It's not, you know, a character on a TV show getting a 3-episode arc where they like kiss a girl for fun and then it moves on. Like it really takes their relationship seriously, even if they end up not being compatible. And for Helen, the relationship helps her discover her sexuality. And for Jessica, it helps her discover herself. Like when we meet Jessica, she stopped painting, she has a job she hates, she's going on dates that she hates even more. And she admits to Helen that she's not happy and also like doesn't really have any interest in trying to be happy. And then queerness frees her from that life. Like whether she's queer or not, queerness forces her to let go of her strict idea of self and to let go of what other people think about her and to let go of perfectionism. Um, my favorite scene in the movie, and possibly your favorite scene in the movie, is the porch scene with Jessica and her mom, played by legend Tova Feldsha. And I do have to just say, because I was like reading up on the movie and stuff, and Tova Feldsha agreed to do this indie comedy because Jennifer Westfeldt was her former assistant, and when she was her assistant, Tova Feldsha's dad died, and Jennifer Westfeldt was like really there for her and really like loving and supportive, even though it was just like her boss. And Tova Feldsha was like, I always remember that, and I was always like, if she ever needs anything from me, like I'll do it. And now, despite her truly incredible career, Tova Feldsha's like, this is the highlight. Is like still just like loves this movie and loves this scene. So for the scene, Jessica's mom is telling an anecdote about how, as a child, Jessica didn't do a school play because her co-star wasn't good enough and she didn't want to be part of something that it wasn't perfect. And in the end, her replacement sucked and her co-star was good and she should have just taken the risk. The scene ends with Jessica's mom saying, I think, and then letting her voice crack in this really amazing way, I think she's a very nice girl. And you realize, like, you know, her mom has figured out that Jessica was dating Helen and she's supportive. I love this scene because, you know, like Jessica, her mom assumed that the key to happiness was marrying a man. She'd also never had the chance to explore, had the chance to realize that exploration could help someone find a new form of happiness. But then when she like gets to see it and she gets to see Jessica happy, she doesn't care about why, and she's just happy that her daughter is happy. And like, of course, not everyone is lucky enough to have a parent who's this supportive, but I do think a lot of parents who struggle with queerness do so from a place of concern. I think they want their kids to have happy lives, to have easy lives, and queerness seems to inhibit that. I remember as a kid, my mom said to me, was like, if you're gay, I'll still love you, but if you're not gay, like stop acting so gay because you're just making your life hard for no reason. And like, obviously now looking back, like it can feel like, oh, that's really harsh, but like I do get it. Like given our culture, given the culture that my mom's comes from, like she saw the limited options and was like, you're either straight or you're gay. And if you're not gay, like I don't want my child to not be happy. And it wasn't until I showed her like alternate forms of identifying and also alternate forms of happiness that she could start to understand. The questioning that both Jessica and Helen do leads them to different but better lives. And I think this is why Kissing Jessica Stein to me is not only a really great queer movie, but also a really great Jewish movie. And like, yes, you have the specifics of Judaism, both religious and cultural, and that's all so delightful and so specific and feels so real. But also just this theme of questioning. I mean, to me, that's what Judaism's all about. And what I love about Judaism is the questioning and that it's encouraged. And exploration is encouraged, and that it's not about answers as much as it is about asking the questions. And it doesn't matter what answers Jessica finds, it matters that she asks the question. And I think we should encourage people of all ages, people who are kids, people who are, past the age where they're supposed to be discovering things about themselves in our culture, like all of it. I think we should encourage everyone to question. People shouldn't have to know who they'll be tomorrow to be trusted with who they are today. And 2 decades later, Kissing Jessica Stein remains a celebration of that fact. It remains a celebration of that queer tradition and the Jewish tradition of questioning.
Thank you so much, Drew. So much in there. Oh my gosh, it's like how to know even where to begin. I will say that I saw this film for the first time when it first came out. I was probably in like my mid-20s. I was about in my mid-20s. And it's hard to remember back to like how different the world actually was then, and like how few representations there were of queerness. And actually, I want to also point out the word queer does not appear in the movie, I don't think even once.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about a time before that was even like the lingo that would have encapsulated all these identities. And that's part of what's so interesting when you watch it now, is you see that there's like this rigidity where so much of the film is about sort of like, but what are you? Sort of like this intense labeling piece. And as you say, like even the gay best friends are sort of like, this is not something you can just try on and see if it fits, right? There's sort of this like hang up about that. And just all the anxiety that comes from wanting people to like be clear about what or who they are. And I just remember the sort of like joy and newness of seeing this, even though it was indie, this like what felt like a very mainstreamy kind of rom-com, hitting all of the New York love story, Nora Ephron kind of beats, but with this different set of characters and like a different kind of plot. And just how fun that was. And then I hadn't seen the movie for a long time until we were doing it for this. And I was like a little apprehensive because I had really fond memories of the movie, but also was like, that was a really long time ago and the world has changed in so many ways. Like, how will this hold up? And what is the lesson that we can draw from it now when we look back at this film? We're like, not only do they not say the word queer, there's like, there's no sense that the gender is not a binary, There's no like sense that like, sort of Helen sleeping with 3 different people is seen as sort of unusual and weird. There's no sort of sense of pansexuality or, polyamory, or there's just like a lot of things that are sort of part of our view of the sexual cosmos now are sort of not really there. And there's just so much focus on like, how are these people going to understand themselves? But I was reading about how the director like talked about this as a love letter to queer people. And I think that kind of love sort of kind of came through. I was also really struck by what you noticed also about like, even though there's so much emphasis that's kind of placed on this whole question of like, are they lesbians? Are they not lesbians? And I think a lot of the analysis of the movie still focuses on that. Like, how do we understand where Jessica is at the end? I think it's clear that Helen has kind of discovered something about herself. Even though she's like very happy sleeping with men at the beginning, she seems to be saying like, oh, I love this. And I think that you didn't mention Jackie Hoffman's character. Jackie Hoffman played the best friend from work who's pregnant and who is just like, I think totally steals so many scenes. She's amazing. She's just so hilarious. And those scenes where Jessica is talking to her and she says like, well, how is it? And she's like, it feels wrong. Everything feels wrong. She's too soft. She's too small. And then she sort of has the same conversation with Helen, who's like, it's amazing, and you sort of realize they're having these 2 different kinds of experiences. But there's still so much like I was reading some of the current analysis of the film, which is like, well, is it that Jessica's actually bi, or is it that she realizes she's straight? And it's interesting, like how that anxiety stays, this sense of like, I need to understand who she is and what her experience is. But I was also really struck by what you noted about like, even if Jessica isn't queer, like there's a way in which experiencing queerness unlocks something in her and like allows her to be more truly herself. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of piece of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also glad you brought up Jackie Hoffman's character, because in that scene where she's talking to Helen, she's like, oh, like, how is it? Is it like, oh, is kissing a woman like it's soft and like it's like getting so, maybe she's just curious and supportive, but like, who knows? Like, I think there's something fun there where you're like, I mean, I think about this sometimes with, different generations, and like when I talk to my parents and, um, like I've asked my parents, like, like when did you know you were straight? And it's like it's obviously not something they were ever asked or something that people are asked even now. And it's so interesting to think like, you know, I'm not saying my parents are secretly closeted or anything, but just like, if they could have had the encouragement to explore, like, who knows what things they could have unlocked or learned about themselves. And there's such like a vast world and a vast world of experiences. And I think that's something that I like about the movie. I love that it's like her straight friend that's like so curious, and not in this way that feels prying or fetishizing, but just like, I don't know, like she's open to exploring, like whatever that means, even with a new baby and like a husband, is still just being like what could this mean if I explore it mentally? And I love that.
Right. She's clearly so excited about it. And we can't tell if she's just like curious or turned on, but like she's certainly open to hearing about it. She's not horrified or judgy the way that Jessica is afraid she might be. She's like,
Right.
really wants to hear. And I think that question of like, sort of like, obviously, I don't think queerness in this movie is a metaphor, but there is a way in which the closet is, because there's so much about Jessica that's sort of like overly buttoned up and hidden away. And so much of the story is about being willing to open that door and step out.
Yeah.
I'm also interested sort of in what the relationship is between that and Jewishness here. Like,
Mhm.
sort of, and I don't know, I have complicated feelings about some of the portrayal of Jewishness. Like on the one hand, I always feel like when you see a movie where, as you were saying, there's like real depictions of Jewish life, that it's not about being Jewish, but it's just part of, creating the scenes and the character. There's something so fun about that. And like seeing Shabbos dinner and seeing, like the kind of funny opening scene in Yom Kippur services. But there's also a way in which there's like such a clear tie of like Jewishness and neuroses and some of Jessica's like less appealing characteristics and some of the kind of like Scarsdale-y jokes and kind of assimilationist, heteronormative, pressure of the mom. And so I don't know. I'm never sure exactly how to read that.
Yeah, it's funny, like, it's one of those things where it's a reality that I certainly have witnessed among, people, and compared to other portrayals that are like this, that don't also grant the characters humanity. Like, I do think part of the reason why the scene on the porch is so moving is that she goes from kind of being this stereotype to like subverting the stereotype. Um, but I also think that it's kind of what we talk about it in the context of like the lack of lesbian representation at the time and how that impacted the ending, where I think like I get that response to the movie because oftentimes like Jewishness is showed this way. And so even a good version of that can still feel like, so like I do very much get that. And I wish that there was, I don't know, like I certainly know a lot of neurotic Jews, but it also would be fun if like, there was a version of this where like Helen was also Jewish and we got to see it manifest differently in someone else. And like that's sort of, I think, the thing that is always in questions of representation is like the more you get, the more freedom you have to sort of like show things that are maybe cliche but true. And then you can like show the cliches in good ways, but then also counteract them with other portrayals. So yeah, I think that's, even though I really recognize like the Jewish culture of this movie, like it it does fall into like a sort of predictable category.
Yeah. Although when you think about it, like I was reading some things that were sort of comparing Jessica's character, like calling her sort of like a, a sort of female Woody Allen type, like an Albie Singer from Annie Hall.
Yeah.
She's way more appealing to me than Albie Singer.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting whether it's New York film or, Jewish film, or I mean, it is one of those things where you're like, he he had such an impact on culture, and like I don't watch his work anymore, and I haven't since like
Right.
2014. And at the same time, I think what's exciting is that like I like, you know, unfortunately I have seen like 40 Woody Allen movies from being a teenager, and like he would never end a movie with his character changing the way that Jessica changes. And so there is something kind of exciting to take that like New York comedy, New York's another character, like they're Jewish neuroses, and be like, just because we're doing the like girl version of it doesn't mean that we have to take all those beats. And so I really like the fact that Jessica becomes kind of the character that she kind of she like if anything, she goes from like being Albie Singer to being Annie Hall in a way that like he sort of was always very arrogant and proud of the fact that he didn't change, and he didn't need to change, he didn't need to really like think about things. And I love that you have this version of this like, and because I'm sure like fictional Jessica saw Woody Allen movies too, like this culture like gets inside of us. And so it's also fun to see someone have that and have that ingrained in her and then break out of it and be like, actually I can find other versions of happiness that and I don't have to sort of continue to tell myself the same story. It's like the story of heterosexuality or heteronormativity. Like it's also another story of like, oh, well, to be important and to live a meaningful life means to constantly be upset and to be judgmental and to, I'm not gonna acknowledge that this other group of people might have some valid things to the way they live their lives, because to admit that is to risk being wrong and is to risk, being looking silly for saying that that way of life is okay. And so I love that she gets over that in a way.
Yeah, totally. The interfaith relationship thing is also interesting from like a film history perspective, because, and in fact, the first time that JWA did something with Kissing Jessica Stein was in 2004. We did a whole bunch of programming around the 350th anniversary of Jewish life in America, including putting together this little film series. And that was actually one of my first jobs at JWA back when I was a grad student and doing freelance work at JWA. I've had a long and storied history at this organization. And I included Kissing Jessica Stein, and I remember reading which then was a new-ish movie. And I remember at the time, like putting it in the context of all these other films like Marjorie Morningstar and, Crossing the Lancey and Private Benjamin and The Way We Were. And I forget what else. There were some other films in there, and so many of which had this kind of storyline of an interfaith relationship and that being sort of this primary tension. And I remember thinking like, it's interesting that this carries that trope in some way, but also it kind of subverts it because they're both women. And so it can't fall into the exact same mode. But then the fact that she ultimately maybe ends up with Josh does seem like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And like, how is it playing with the idea of like, what is good about relationships with someone who is the same as you in some way and someone who is different from you, and sort of how does like the Jewish thing work with the gender thing? And I appreciated that play and how that like opened up. And I think that that's part of what happens here in this film also, like even when it's using some of those same kind of like tropes of the rom-com or whatever, the fact that it's a lesbian relationship just necessarily shifts something, because it can't, there's a subversion that's built in because they can't be inhabiting the same roles as the kind of traditional model. And so that like allows you to question other things about it.
Yeah, I really agree with that.
I definitely want to talk about Tova Feldshuh, who is, I think also like that porch scene is just like, I cry every time I watch it. And just, she gets that little like starting to say it and then holding her face. I mean, just the look that goes across her face. Oh my God, it's so masterful. And we're big fans of her at JWA, and she's done a bunch of stuff with us. And I think she's like I think you could do a whole film series, maybe we'll do this sometime, of just movies where she plays or other things where she plays a Jewish mother. I don't know if you've ever seen A Walk on the Moon with Diane Lane and Liev Schreiber. So amazing movie, totally recommend it. And she plays the mother or grandmother in that, and also like amazing. And then of course she's the Jewish mother in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which is a little bit less of a positive depiction. So it's like, I love like seeing her, you know, sort of again, like also like playing that role, but also subverting it and making it more complex when you don't think it's necessarily going to be, because she's such a like, let me fix up my daughter kind of person. And I love the way you wrote about it in your piece about Kissing Jessica Stein and autostraddle. And can I just read one line from
please?
And you're writing about sort of what you were saying before about like you come to see her kind of pushiness as a mother is really about seeking happiness for her kid. But then you say, the scene is wish fulfillment for many a queer, but it works because at its core is a painful truth. Heteronormativity and even homophobia can come from a place of love. And I just thought that was a really beautiful and honest and generous analysis of that, and of, you know, so many dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I think both in life and in storytelling, like the more you can see everyone as a person, and I think one of the reasons the movie works is like, I mean, when Josh is rejected on the roof, like it's painful. Like he's kind of the epitome of the character who I, in a lot of other movies, I wouldn't care about at all, and instead, like his character is written with a lot of nuance and feels really real and is well acted. And there is a moment where you're like, oh, I really feel for him, and at least I did. And like, I think same thing with her mom. And I think it's just always being able to think about where different people are coming from, and like not in the sense of excusing homophobia or excusing any other forms of bigotry, but just in the sense of being like, you know, we can't confront these things if we don't see the humanity in the people who we're trying to talk to convince about things, to even just survive alongside.
Mm-hmm. And I think both those moments, the moment on the roof and the moment on the porch, part of why we're able to feel that sense of identification is because the characters have made themselves vulnerable, right? Like Josh on the roof has made himself vulnerable, and we've seen him so defended in other scenes and like really frankly being an asshole. So like to see him vulnerable and being open and expressing that, like you do feel a sense like, oh, this is a person who is like longing for something and we know isn't going to get it in that moment. And and that's kind of hard. But
I mean, I also think that like if Jessica's queerness or Jessica's relationship with Helen changes her life for the better, it also changes Josh's life for the better. Like it completely, I think, causes him to have this moment of like he just never thought of Helen as like, I mean, this is using very like masculine and straight and whatever toxic terms, but like as a threat. Like he hadn't even considered the possibility that his ex-girlfriend could end up with a woman. And so it causes him to have to like restructure his way of thinking. You know, if John Hamm had shown up at the wedding, he would have been like, yeah, of course, like this guy got her. But like the fact that it's Helen, it fully like, I don't know, affects him, I think, in a way that's really positive.
right. It's like another way that there's some kind of subversion of the usual, like that's why subversion works, right? Because it's like, it is making you question what you would assume is going to be the next step. And then that calls everything else into question. And that like creates room for new understanding of things. And we see that happening in his character too. And I think we see it, like, I think I said earlier, like I see this part of what appeals to me about this movie, or did when I watched it the first time, is how it it had that sort of Nora Ephron-y New York rom-com feel to it, which like I'm definitely prone to. But I was also thinking about how in some ways it's like this interesting reversal or subversion of When Harry Met Sally, which I will say is another one of my like all-time favorite, I could recite every line of it, movies. You know, and there, like the tagline is something like, you know, can two friends sleep together and still love each other in the morning? And in this, it's more like, can two lovers not sleep together and like still love each other and be friends? And it's sort of like playing with the idea of just like, you know, we have these certain ideas of like what a friendship, what is capable between men and women, and putting it only in sort of this romantic box. And I think so much like part of what also I find really interesting in this movie is like, as you know, just thinking about like what about just the intensity of relationships among women, and like where does sex and desire fit into that? Where is it platonic? Like what do you need from your relationships? Like how important is sex? Like as you said, like a huge piece of the story really is just that like Helen and Jessica have different needs in terms of sex, and so like that's going to be a mismatch for them aside from any questions of sexuality. There's, I mean, of sexual orientation, there's just a question of like what they're actually looking for. And you get the sense that, and I think I even read in an article that Jennifer Westfeldt said, yeah, like Jessica would have stayed in this relationship forever. Even if like they weren't having sex that much, because like everything else was so great. And for Helen, that's a deal breaker. And so it's kind of an interesting question. And of course, asexuality is not something that is going to be discussed in this film either, which maybe in a 2023 version would come up in some other way. But I think that that's kind of an interesting piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the like the whole message about perfectionism? Like some of that I feel like gets a little sort of messy because there's the whole message about perfectionism, which obviously there's a lot of work that like Jessica has to do to be able to take risks and let go of of a sense that like she can't do something if it can't be perfect. And then at the same time, there's also a sense of like not wanting to settle and like wanting, and one of the lines Helen has when they're breaking up is she says like, I want the whole package.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a little bit, one of the movies we did, the first movie we did in this series was Yentl. And there's one of the sort of like climactic moments in that film is when Avigdor, when she reveals herself to Avigdor as a woman, and he's sort of saying, okay, well, we could get married and you could like study secretly at night. And she's like, no. And he says, well, what more do you want? And she just, you know, Streisand in her just amazingly powerful way just looks at him and says, more. And it reminds me also of like When Harry Met Sally, when Harry's calling her high maintenance and she just sort of shrugs and says, I want it the way I want it. And like, I feel like that, and he says, yeah, high maintenance, you know, but I feel like that thread of just like allowing women to be like, I actually want more and that's okay, is like a huge, like, to me, that's like the crux of feminist movies, basically, is just like allowing women to have desires that actually they're allowed to have and allowed to express and maybe even allowed to fulfill. And so I felt like as I was watching this movie this time, I was like, where does that fit in with the kind of like perfectionism versus holding out for what you really want?
Yeah. I mean, I touch upon this a bit in my essay, but I do think that there's a difference between perfectionism and ambition or desire, because Jessica's perfectionism is actually just like preventing her from doing anything, right? Like, yes, there's something in her that is being like, I don't want to just end up with any random guy just because like I'm the age where my mom has decided I need to get married. But like it also isn't allowing her to do the things that she would need to do in herself and meeting other people to actually like achieve this goal that she has. So I do think that I don't actually see it really as a contradiction. I think oftentimes the idea to be, you know, it's like kind of a cliche, like the idea that the desire to be perfect can prevent you from like doing something at all. And you know, I think it's interesting because in in the porch scene, like queerness and doing something wrong are kind of equated on first glance. But ultimately what I think it's saying isn't, because the whole thing of like, oh, if she'd done the play, like maybe it could have been the best ever, or maybe it wouldn't have been, it still would have been good. And that's Jessica's relationship with Helen, right? Like the idea of, can she commit to this relationship and see where it goes, even if it turns out that she's wrong, either wrong about being queer or wrong about Helen, and like what does it mean to take that risk and to, I don't know. I mean, I know for a long time, like I was always really embarrassed of the thought of like getting into a relationship and then like telling people in my life, like I'm dating this person, and then being like, oh, actually it didn't work out. I mean, like for some reason, even though all people go through breakups, the idea of a breakup, especially like a breakup, not years down the line after like something's happened or whatever, but like felt embarrassing or felt like felt like a failure. And I do think something that I believe so strongly now and really want to push towards just in myself and in people in general is that like a relationship lasting a short period of time doesn't make it a failure. Like, yes, I know there are people who want to meet one person and get married and be with that person for the rest of their life, and I hope those people achieve that goal. But also, if you spend 10 years with someone and 8 of those are good and 2 are bad, so you get divorced, like that can still be a really successful marriage, a really successful relationship. Like spending, I don't know how long it ends up being that they're together, but I think like 6 months to 9 months, like spending 6 to 9 months with someone and completely changing, or not even changing who you are, but letting the parts of you that you've been silencing like escape, like that's a success. Jessica and Helen don't end up together, but I do think that their relationship ends up, it feels like a happy ending to me. I mean, to like these characters have come such a long way and they get to still be friends in the end. And like we don't need to like say that like a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship is inherently better than a friendship. Like it's not. So again, I get the context of like 2001, 2002, feeling like, oh, I just want like the women to end up together. Like I totally, totally, totally get that feeling. But watching it now, it really feels like it's such a happy ending to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think part of what you're talking about too is sort of like that slightly overwrought lipstick metaphor of like, are you going for like, it has to be one that meets all your needs, or like, can you blend? And like life is blending, like maybe not all at once the way Helen does at the beginning for everybody, but like your life is like, it's a pastiche of some kind. It's not like
Yeah.
one, straight narrative, as it were. I think ending is really an interesting question, and like whether it's a happy ending, whether it's a bit of a cop out, whether it's subversive, whether is it a happily ever after. I see Helene is saying in the chat that like there's like really intimate connection between Jessica and Helen at the end, and I feel that too. And I love that, even though I have to say like I don't love the suggestion that she and Josh get back together, because I'm never able to get past like how horrible he is to her at that dinner party and just how mean and nasty and like yuck. But I know that in an earlier version of the script, or maybe they even shot it and then reshot it, like they were going to have it end with like the two of them walk out of that bookstore together and she goes back to his apartment. And then it's like a much clearer sense that they're getting back together. And it ends with Josh and Jessica together. And I love that, even though, first of all, there's a little ambiguity, but also that it ends with Helen and Jessica together, because I think that does give us that sense that like ultimately that's the important relationship here.
Yeah.
And then of course also there's it cracks me up that that's this one scene where Jessica's hair is curly. Like that's how we know that she has achieved her true authentic self, because she's gone back to her Jewish hair. I think it always comes back to the Jewish hair. We talked about this a lot, as you can imagine, last week in talking about Dirty Dancing and Baby's frizzy hair. But that just kind of cracked me up. We could do a film series on Jewish hair as well.
Truly. Yeah, I do really love that detail, especially just, I mean, like, me and every other Jewish girl are just like, like my mom has always straightened her hair. my sister from a very young age straightened her hair. I mean, I make jokes and people are like, oh my God, I love your curls. Like, what's your secret? I'm like, well, I transitioned at 23. And so I got to bypass the like high school years of burning my hair because of societal pressure. So that's one tip. And then also here are some products, but like it is like a detail that feels just like, I don't know, I really like. It's like both a little too easy and also fun.
Totally. I see we have some comments in the chat about the ending also. And I will agree with Rachel, like I should be more forgiving towards Josh. I know that people can change. I think I just found that scene to be so humiliating and mean that it was a little hard for me, though he does make himself more vulnerable there. Let's get to some of the questions in the chat. I'm sorry, I've been sort of ignoring those questions because I was enjoying our conversation so much. I know that there were some questions from Andrea Drew about your work and whether there are any other films about queer Jewish women that you would recommend, and also how does Judaism influence your own filmmaking projects?
Recently there was a movie called Sahara that I think is incredible. It's like one of my favorite recent movies. It's about these two teenage Jewish girls at a funeral, and like also like a funeral slash like teen talk back about grief or whatever, and it's so funny and sad and really it's so good. So that like highly recommend. And how does Judaism influence my own work? It's interesting because I didn't grow up super religious, and it's been sort of a journey over recent years to realize here, I just saw someone ask, I'll type it in the chat. It's been interesting to realize like just how much Judaism has impacted my life, and like just even culturally, just like certain things where I'm like, oh, this is so Jewish. And it's like, what do I mean by that? Right. It's also, and it's so interesting when we talk about like Jewish media in general of like, are we talking about these like cliches, which are very specific to New York or LA, upper middle class, white, it's like a very specific reform Judaism. Like that's really what, when we're talking about the like Scarsdale jokes and the, a lot of the stuff on like Transparent or things like that. It's like a very specific Judaism. And not to bring it back to what I said earlier, but I do think it's the questioning and the ambiguity. I think I really gravitate towards writing things that are open-ended and that feel exploratory and that are willing to not like push boundaries in like a controversial whatever way, but just like trying to ask questions more than provide answers. And it's also why, to me, like my Judaism and my queerness feel very connected. And I think like I can't separate them because they both feel like they have that principle, and it feels like something that's just so important to me. And I mean, I definitely think there will be times where like in work that I make, and there's been stuff that I've written where it's like, this is very clearly like a Jewish character or like a culturally Jewish character. Like it probably isn't talked about, but when I'm thinking about the character, especially if it's a family based on mine or something like that, it's just, I mean, it's why it's so important that movies are made by a wide variety of people, because I think we all do that regardless of whether we're trying to. And maybe someday I'll do something that's like very explicitly like, this is a very Jewish movie. But even when I'm not doing that, if I'm writing a family and they're loosely based on my own or my experience as a family, like they're going to be Jewish. And if they're not, then then I'm very explicitly thinking about them not being Jewish or them being whatever. So yeah, I think it just sort of is both something that I do think a lot about, but is also something that's just kind of inherent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking also, as I was watching this, about some of the ways that culturally Jewishness and queerness get sort of read together, I guess just as a sort of way of talking about otherness or talking about representation or talking about assimilation or whatever, the theme is. And I was thinking about that in this film too, that like, it's interesting that Jessica is such a Jewishly identified character. Like they didn't have to, I don't know actually if Jennifer Westfeldt is Jewish. Is she? Do you know?
Oh wow, I just assumed,
I assume too,
but
but I'm just
also maybe not. Yeah.
right. It's just occurring to
Oh,
me like
she is. Okay. Someone said, yeah.
someone said she is. Okay. Yeah, Helene would know. So that may just be that, like you're saying, that you're writing out of your life, like she was writing out of her life. But I also wonder if it like just, how would the movie be different if that weren't the case? Like if like it allows certain cultural references that can bring up these questions about difference and sameness and family expectations and assimilation. And again, not that Jews have cornered the market on that. Obviously, there are so many communities that have those, those dynamics are human dynamics, but they do appear in particular ways in Jewish contexts and especially in American Jewish contexts in this particular case that I think kind of support the question, the queerness of the film as well.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you would, watching it in 2023, are there things that you like, how would you update it if you were updating it?
I guess it depends on, I mean, there are small things, right? Like even though I said that I think the way that um the one of Helen's friends talks is like probably is like feels very true to that character. I still, would, I mean, I'd probably keep the biphobia because that's pointed and part of the story, and cut the like casual racism because it's just like not a part of the story, and so it just is like isn't necessary. So there's like little things like that that just feel very like anytime you watch. I was gonna say a movie from 2002, but really you could watch stuff that came out this year, and you're still like, can you just cut that line? Why are you doing that? But I mean, one of the things that I really like about it is that they both, um, like both Jessica and Helen haven't had experiences with women before, and I do think that if I do think it makes it kind of unique in the sense that a lot of movies that maybe have a similar dynamic of like, oh, there's one person who's more into it and the other one is like struggling to accept her queerness. It's usually like, oh, this experienced lesbian, either they're teenagers or if they're adults, it's like, oh, an experienced lesbian meets a straight girl and they struggle with that. So I wouldn't want to change that though. I really like that aspect of it. I think I would like to see more of, I think the ambiguity of the ending would feel more pointed and rather than like, I'm aware that we're like projecting a lot onto it and like, which I think is a good thing to do with art, but I do think in my dream version, we'd spend more time. We'd see Helen and her new relationship. We'd see Helen's community that she's formed. I also think that it would be cool if like Jessica was sort of, it was more ambiguous as far as like the end, instead of her being like, I wasn't gay enough, which again, it feels like something that's so, like I've heard people say that about, I mean, people are constantly saying that even still, we still have this cultural pressure of like gay enough or this enough or whatever. And so people who don't have, a lot of bisexual people who don't have like certain experiences or whatever will be like, well, I'm not really. And it's like, that's the culture talking. So I don't know. I really like this movie as like a time capsule. And I sort of like I don't really want to change that much about it. I do want more rom-coms, more queer Jewish rom-coms though, that's for sure.
Me too, definitely. That would be great. We'll put that wish out into the universe. But there was something else I was just going to say that now has flown out of my head, but about something you were just saying. One of the things that I noticed also, and I don't know, I'm not sure how to read this, whether it's like, there's that whole piece where at the beginning where Helen is talking about the three guys that she's involved with and how like she goes to this one for this and this one for this and this one for this. And Jessica's like, who do you go to when you're sick? And she's like, oh, I don't get sick. And then of course we know she's going to get sick and Jessica's going to take care of her, of course. But what was interesting to me at the end is it seems like maybe Helen is just with one woman. And like, I wasn't sure whether to read that as like, oh, it's because she's realized that actually she's more fulfilled by women. And so she doesn't need to be with these three different people to meet her different needs. or if that was, or maybe we just are only seeing her with one person and that's one of many partners that she has. But I also wondered if that's one of the ways that Helen learns from Jessica, like that Jessica's like, you also have to like allow yourself to be in a relationship that's real enough that someone can take care of you, and where you're not just like going to people for like specific needs. Like I go with you for this, but you know, that there's sort of like a more holistic view of like really letting somebody in a more vulnerable way. That is what Helen takes from Jessica, because I think we certainly see how Jessica changes throughout the film, and there's a little bit less of how Helen changes. And I wondered if that was meant to be one little kind of crumb of that.
I really like that, because I do think that it's very clear. I don't know. I think the reason why Helen's allowed to let some of those walls down is because she's so focused on trying to get Jessica to let her walls down that she doesn't realize, like, oh wait, like we've now entered into this thing that isn't, because we've been waiting to have sex, like now that's what I usually lead with, and now I'm just like in this relationship, and it is like a fun thing.
Right. And of course, I will say, and there were a couple comments about this. I think Rachel said this in the comments also, like for all of the kind of joking about trying to get Jessica comfortable with moving their sexual relationship along, it's pretty tame in terms of showing anything or suggesting anything. And I think maybe that's a place where it might be a little bit different if you made it in 2023. Like there might be a little more room to talk more explicitly about like, well, how could she make this better for her? Or like, how could they work on that part of the relationship in different ways? And I think that's one.
I hope so. I do think that, like, you know, online discourse is online discourse, but there is kind of like, we're not in like a great time for sex scenes right now. And it is to me disappointing, because I think there's a lot that you can do with a sex scene. And yeah, that's definitely one thing that I would have welcomed, not necessarily with this production team, because I do think it's good to, you can usually tell when like a queer movie or like a lesbian movie doesn't have like any lesbians around. But yeah, it's so funny because you're going on this journey and you're like, oh my god, when are they gonna have sex? When are they gonna have sex? And then they do, and it's like cut to black, and you're like, no, what? Like I waited all that time also. Like it was only like 20 minutes in movie time, but still.
Right. You're like, where's my happy ending here?
I mean, the scene though where like they're talking to those two guys who are totally oblivious that they're on it, that just got on a date, and then like she starts to like creep her finger up. That's a good scene.
That is a good
They
scene.
definitely have so much chemistry. And I wish that Heather Jurgensen had been in more things. Like she's so good and so hot in this. And I was like, I was like,
Where
I
did
wish
she go?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what led to this, right? She does like breathwork stuff in LA. Like I Googled her name, like that's what she's doing, but she hasn't really been like in the industry for a while. And I don't know if it's, you know, like making a queer indie is not often, especially in the early 2000s, like a ticket to, I mean, you think of something like Saving Face, and like it took Alice Wu how many years to make the half of it, like 17 or something. Like those aren't, I think most of the queer movies from I don't know, we could say like 2008, the filmmakers made one, maybe two. I mean, you even have like Incredibly True Adventure of Two Girls in Love. The director of that did Puccini for Beginners, but like that was, so it was like I was like, oh wow, like a success, like you've got to make a second movie. And there are obviously exceptions to that, but like I do think the industry wasn't and still isn't, but especially wasn't like super kind to even a successful version of this. They're kind of like, oh, you did it.
Right.
I don't think it's also a coincidence that of the two, the one to be more successful is the one who ultimately, like, yes, she's the lead, but like Jennifer Westphal also plays the character that ends up, you know, being straight.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. I have to say, just as an aside, it was very funny to see John Hamm in like a throwaway role. Like no one knew who he was at the time because it was pre-Mad Men, and he just happened to be Jennifer Westfeld's boyfriend. And yeah.
I was thinking, like, if he had been Josh, like how different would the movie be? I don't know. It's just like something I was thinking about.
Right. I think that's who they originally wanted for Josh, but he had a gig, and so he could only be in like one little scene. But yeah. Yes, it matters. It matters who the people are. I, of course, like it, when I was watching this again, having not seen it in a long time, I was like, oh my God, it's Max Medina from Gilmore Girls is Josh. I didn't remember that at all. And it's funny how you have these like overlays of characters, and I had to wrap my head back around to who Josh was.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, we have come to the end of our conversation for tonight, but thank you so much, Drew, for this wonderful conversation, for giving us new insights on the film. Thanks to all of you who are with us in the room for joining this conversation. This was really so fun. As always, there is more to explore. We've put some links in the chat and we'll drop them in there again. Drew's piece on Kissing Jessica Stein and Queer Jewish Anxiety and Autostraddle is awesome. Please read that. At JWA, we have a lovely review written by my colleague Emma Brightman on the expansive queerness of Kissing Jessica Stein. You can also watch my conversation with Tova Feldshuh about her memoir, Lilyville, which is about her own Jewish mother. So lots of Jewish mother exploration there. You can watch the trailer of JWA's own documentary about Jewish women in comedy called Making Trouble, which features Jackie Hoffman, who's always hilarious. This was the final session of our inaugural film club, but have no fear, we will be returning in just a few weeks with another series of book talks beginning on Thursday, March 9th, same time, same place. If you would like us to do another film club, if you enjoyed this, let us know. We would certainly consider that. Give us some suggestions of the films you would like us to cover. I have lots of ideas, but I'm sure you all do too. Would love to learn from that. For our book talks, you can see the lineup and register at jwa.org/events. Might have to scroll down a little bit to find the registration. And I hope to see you all there. Again, thank you so much, Drew. Thanks, everybody. And until next time, be well and have a great evening.